Um, so just a couple of things about Locke, and you can kind of take those things that we've talked about forward, right? The most important thing with the Locke stuff is not all the details about his theory of social contract and the state of nature and all that stuff. Really, it's just how he's using the Eurocentric ontology to justify his kinds of claims in a similar way that Sepulveda does. So we talked about how Locke uses, what I call the Eurocentric fallacy of time, which is, kind of the Eurocentric tautology and the developmentalist fallacy rolled together, right? To declare that while Europe is in the present and so exists as a civil society, indigenous people are in the past and as savage people and so exist in a state of nature. And part of this way of sort of separating out Europeans from indigenous people as sort of civilized and state of nature is using both the Eurocentric tautology, we are the best, right? So if you're not us, you are less than, and also a developmentalist fallacy that we are the best and we are the most complete, the most developed. And so you are not us, you are less than, and you are also less developed, and in a kind of inherent way. That this is what is kind of like the notions of race, it's inherent in you. It's not something that, can change. It's almost biological, right? It's how you will be without, as we see later on, this kind of intervention from white civilized society to bring you out of your inherent state of nature. So this is how he uses this kind of Eurocentric tautology and developmentalist fallacy to kind of create a notion of time, that whatever Europeans are doing right now is the present. And whatever indigenous people are doing, as long as it's different in any way, that makes them savage and in the past, right? So the example we talked about in the essay on Locke, was when John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, said, the proof that indigenous people were savages and primitive was that they didn't use oxen to plow their field. Like literally exactly what Europeans do at any given moment. Obviously, we wouldn't say that now. It'd be something else. Whatever we're doing now, whatever technology we're using, is the definition of the present, right? And people that are not doing that are, by definition, in the past. So this is sort of how Locke uses the Eurocentric tautology and developmentalist fallacy to kind of talk about time, the present and the past, and civilized versus savage people in a state of nature. Now, the other part, putting this all together for Locke then to justify colonization in America, because Locke claims that America is in a state of nature, that the land, this is part of the geographical notion, that the land, the place itself is in a state of nature, and that Indians and Europeans who make contact with them are perfectly in a state of nature. How does this make it impossible for indigenous people to legally resist European colonization? Well, the answer is that if America is in a state of nature, then appropriation without consent is a law of nature, according to Locke, and thus by merely defending their land from invasion, indigenous people are violating natural law, right? And so there's a lot more detail kind of embedded in there from the Locke theory, but basically the idea is sort of understanding that formula, that the way that he defines America as in a state of nature, and that in a state of nature, appropriation without consent is a law of nature. That means by saying this is my land, indigenous people even say that, this is my land, you can't take it, then they're violating natural law, and then just war is justified. Invasive, aggressive war is justified against them. Okay, so those are the two kind of Locke things to remember. Any questions about those? Now, these things kind of show up again in the conversation about the racial contract. Some of these are, I guess we could go over all of these. So there's a few kinds of points about the racial contract. Yeah, okay. So if you remember, the discussion about the racial contract sort of has connected to it the notion of the social contract. And what's important about remembering the social contract is that, it's a kind of power of the people notion, that people sort of considered kind of equal, in equal power, come together and through this kind of metaphorical contract notion to found civil society. And the idea is that that sort of notion of civil society is based on these social contract ideals. There's liberty, equality, equal rights, equal power for everyone in this society that's built out of their equal consent. Right? So it has these ideals of a non-racialized or racially demarcated society. So part of what Charles Mills is doing in the racial contract book is sort of articulating how we can both have, in a place like the United States, this notion of the social contract and social contract ideals, putting forth in a kind of top level value sort of way the notion of equal status, rights, liberty, power of each individual, while still having a racial polity where the status of white and non-white are demarcated by law and custom, right? We can have things like the Virginia slave codes, we can have all these things while still maintaining the notions of, we believe in the social contract ideals, liberty, justice, rights, power for all. And part of this goes back to the Locke sort of notion. If you look at this first little line from his book, the crucial metamorphosis in the social contract is between humans in a state of nature, demarcated by a temporary pre-political state of all humans regardless of race, into humans in a civil society. In the racial contract, this turns into a conceptual partitioning of human populations into those who are inherently civilized, categorized as white, and those who are inherently savage in a permanently non-political state of nature, categorized as non-white. Now, it ought to be really clear, that's just what we were talking about in Locke, right? That's exactly what Locke does, right? Partitions not just this sort of abstract notion of a state of nature that all civilized societies come out of, but now in the present, there are people who are inherently civilized and people who are inherently savage, and we conceptualize the world that way according to this racial contract categorization, not just the state of nature in an abstract sense and civil society out of which it comes, but state of nature people and civilized people at any moment in time. Now, this means, as we talked about, because non-white people are inherently savage in a permanently non-political state of nature, that an intervention from white people is always necessary in order to create a civilized society in places that are populated by non-white people. So the example we gave when we talked about that was how people think of the imagery of the pilgrims sort of crossing the border illegal, sort of illegal immigrants, that sort of conceptualization. People are like, well, that doesn't make sense because there weren't laws in America before white people came. What? Right? You see how that thinking is inherent in there, that only when white people come does civilized society even have the possibility of being. That inherent sort of notion that demarcates the state of nature, inherently savage non-white people and the inherently civilized, white people. So that's that concept that connects to then also the way in which the racial contract, as opposed to the social contract, that is supposed to establish a kind of notion of equal status for each individual, in the state of nature, sort of coming out of that equality of our natural state into the equality of the civil state, right? So under the social contract, human beings who are equal, right, in the state of nature become social and civil beings who are politically obligated to a neutral state that protects their equal rights liberty, power, and so on. But the racial contract, is an agreement to found a racial polity where the status of white and non-white are demarcated by law and custom, as seen, for example, in the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. But it's also important, as we talked about, that both the law and custom, right, because sometimes it's been legalized sort of status segregation in the racial polity, but sometimes it's more customs. It's not as if there's something founded in the law about redlining or those sorts of things. Sometimes it just becomes sort of customs of treating white and non-white differently under the law. We can see that in the mass incarceration, all kinds of things, right, that aren't just laws on the books, but they're kind of the interpretations of the law and so on, who is sort of seen as criminal and so on, right? That's the part of the law and custom, that it's not just laws that are racist, right? There's all kinds of other stuff that maintains this segregated status of white and non-white under the racial contract in a racial polity. But it's also important. Yes, there's a question?
I was going to ask, so does the social, sorry, I have my retainer in.
That's okay. We're all just hanging out here. It's, it's like a Sunday afternoon.
I know, right?
Coffee.
So does the social contract, is that more for, I guess, natives, for Native Americans?
Okay,
Like,
so go ahead. Did you say some more?
well, no, go ahead, because I can't really articulate exactly
Okay.
what I'm thinking, but I was just wondering, like, is it more towards like Native Americans? Because I guess they would be more of probably the people that they're trying to get to be like, I guess, civilized or.
I mean, these notions become kind of ubiquitous. So like the idea of the social contract is just a broad sort of notion, right? It's the idea that, take anywhere in the world, right? The idea that Locke and Hobbes and these people in the 1600s are writing about this, particularly about England, right? They're imagining, okay, we've got this great civilization of England, the British Commonwealth at this time. At some point, our grandfathers, grandmothers back were in a state of nature, right? We weren't a civilized society. We were just running around wherever we were, in this kind of state of nature reality, without laws, without society. We were just, hunter-gatherers or whatever, right? And we transformed from that state of nature place into a civil society through this social contract concept, right? That we sort of recognized, oh, we're in this place and we can equally, like I can hunt what I want and you can hunt what you want. I mean, of course, all this stuff is kind of bizarre anthropology anyway, right? But this is how they did it. Everyone's sort of like just, in this sort of Garden of Eden or kind of fighting for game, however you sort of imagine it. And we recognize, oh, we would be better off if we kind of move to this place where we weren't free to just take whatever we want, but we had some rules that kind of limited our freedoms a little bit, but protected us, like laws, right? Property rights and all this kind of stuff. That's really all the social contract is. It's not really, it's this broad notion of creating a kind of democratic society, like something like we imagine the United States is, where it's where we can, freely kind of participate in this sort of set of laws and rules that are designed to enhance our freedoms and protections and so on, not oppress us. It's not like we don't live in a kingdom where the king just tells us off with our heads and we die. And we have, we live in this sort of society that has these social contract ideals of rights, liberty, equal power, all that kind of stuff. That's really all the social contract is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So then the idea is what Mills is saying is that broad notion, as much as it's sort of a pretty picture of how we might want to live, we might want to say like, yeah, this seems great. We're all kind of recognize each other as kind of equal. There's resources we need. We might be fighting over them. We live in this kind of state of nature kind of thing. Then we'll give up some of that freedom to just take whatever I want to kind of create a society where we're still equal. We still have equal rights and equal power and so on, but we have some laws that protect us, protect our property rights and so on. And what Charles Mills is saying that in the context of those kinds of claims of creating a social contract reality, I like the idea that this is the United States. It sort of comes out of this social contract. Everybody has rights, liberty, power, and so on. That's kind of BS. That's not really, that's a story that we tell, but underneath that is this more subtle contract of the racial contract where we separate out, people that are considered because of their non-white status, whether they're African Americans or Native Americans or whatever, because they're non-white, they are inherently savage, right? They're inherently more animalistic and not capable of, participating fully in the social contract ideal. So we kind of create the ideal of a social contract, but then the reality of a racial contract that segregates the white and non-white, so that non-white people in that society don't actually get the equal rights, liberty, power, and so on. Does that help kind of clarify?
Oh yeah, that helps a lot.
Okay. And part of why, like if you look at the some of these laws that we've talked about that demarcate, white and non-white in different kinds of laws, like the most obvious is sort of segregation, like, different bathrooms, different parts of the bus, those sorts of things that are legal. People go to jail for breaking those sorts of things. Oftentimes, and especially in modern kind of times, they're much more subtle. The categorization, the legal and moral status that categorizes, that by which we categorize non-white is often subtle and indirect. And the reason why that's the case is because it helps maintain the illusion of equality for all, right? Because as people become more invested in sort of thinking about, hey, we've got this social contract ideal, but it sure seems like this is not really how we're running things. The more people sort of see the illusion, are disillusioned by the claims of the social contract ideal, the less they function as an ideal. People are like, that whole thing about liberty, justice, equality for all is a bunch of nonsense, right? So part of maintaining the illusion of that ideal is making the distinctions more subtle. So it's not just like, hey, look on the books. The laws say if you're black, this is what applies to you. If you're white, this applies to you. Less of that makes it easier to maintain the illusion. Does that make sense? The more it's kind of subtle demarcation rather than something really obvious legally on the books, the more we can say, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. This is a great society. Everybody is treated equally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. So we'll skip over some of these things. There was the story of Roger Williams, and we talked about just some examples of the way in which this notion of the obligation, as Mills puts it, to the extent that those phenotypically, genealogically, culturally categorized as white fail to live up to the civil and political responsibilities of whiteness under the racial contract, that they're in dereliction of their duties as citizens. And so there's a lot of kind of pressure put on them, kind of like race traitor kind of concept. That you see that in the story of Roger Williams and in Davy Crockett, these various examples where individuals rejected, in some sense, the racial contract and were targeted, were kind of, blackballed from society by not going along with the ball game of separating out in this sort of categorical way whites and non-whites under law and custom. So then a couple other things, just a few more concepts from the racial contract, just a few things to kind of remember. What is the engine of the racial contract? Mills says that the economic racial contract as an exploitation contract that creates global European economic domination and national white racial privilege. That's what drives it, right? But we can see that already. Remember what we were talking about in terms of hypodescent and not hypodescent, the notion of one drop, makes you black, and one drop non-native makes you not native, just nothing. That those notions are driven by the economic racial contract, right? Because in one case, land is available. In the other case, slave labor is available. And so those ideas of race that drive even those notions of race, much less the kind of the way that that's framed in terms of the racial contract, all are from this kind of economic engine that underlies it. That's his claim. The developmentalist fallacy is necessary to maintain the illusion of what he calls, or what is generally called in history, the European miracle, right? That Europe made it on its own because of the peculiar characteristics of Europe or Europeans, rather than at the expense of or through the exploitation of non-whites. So the European miracle is the sort of notion that, well, we don't know why. I mean, somehow Europe just became the super global power, just because it was so great and had all these sort of technological inventions and so on. And that requires a developmentalist fallacy, because the reality is that as much of that rise came at the expense of or through the exploitation of non-white people, right? So the example we gave in class, in the early sort of colonization of Mexico, you have the massive sort of pillaging of the Mexicans, silver mines, and indigenous Mexican people used as slaves to mine their own silver mines and put it on the boats back to Spain, by which Spain becomes the most wealthy country in the world. They didn't do that. I mean, what about Spain made that possible? They took some boats and they took the silver from the indigenous people of Mexico. That the real story requires that kind of at the expense of the indigenous people of Mexico, or through the exploitation of those people, to understand how Spain became at that moment the wealthiest country in the world. Then a couple things about the epistemological contract. So just part of this, just like we were saying, the part of the notion of the racial contract requires a notion of the social contract, right? Because you have to have these ideals. If you just live in a society where it's like the king tells you whatever to do, and you have no power as a citizen, you're just a subject of a king, and there's no ideal of equality for every person, equal rights for every person, equal freedom for every person. If you don't have that as an ideal, then there's nothing to hide, right? Only when you have that ideal, but then you have a racially sort of hierarchy, structured hierarchical society, then you have to hide that inside this projected social contract ideal. And this is a part of where the epistemological contract works, because it's the way in which we see the world wrongly. We're able to say, hey, we live in a perfect society. It's sort of a social contract ideal. Everyone's free. There's no racism. There's no kind of unequal treatment. Everything is perfect. We have to pretend like we're not seeing the reality that's right in front of us in order to say that. And that's a part of this epistemological contract. And it's a kind of agreement. The contract part is the agreement to misinterpret the world, right? To say, hey, there's no racism. But it's also not just me doing it. Part of the contract thing and the racial contract structure is that there's a sense in which I will be validated by white epistemic authority. If I say there's no racism, I'm not going to get called out on that, at least not generally. People are going to say, yeah, you're right. I agree. I agree with your mistaken perceptions. I agree with your your hiding the sort of truth. We all just kind of play this game of hide the racism, and then we're support each other in the process of that through this kind of epistemological contract, right? So that's what he calls the epistemological contract. Okay, so that's all the stuff I wanted to cover in the early stuff. Then we have some questions from Alcoff, a few questions from Linton, some questions about the Douglas, and some questions about Du Bois. Any questions about what we've looked at so far? Oh, it's already almost 4 o'clock. Any questions? Okay.